MSD families, parents, students. Thank you so much for attending our webinar this evening. We look forward to sharing some great information with you. We're about 7 now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And of course, if anyone keeps coming in, we'll still allow them in as we're already moving along. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your time today. And you've joined Bright World Tutors webinar, Mastering the SAT and ACT, Keys to College Success. So tonight we'll go over a lot of great information for you. Before we jump on in, I'd love to know what kind of parents, students, and families we have here this evening. So if you could let us know either in the chat or the Q&A feature here in Zoom, what grade you or your student is in. I know we could have families from 9th, 10th, 11th, maybe seniors. So it's just always good to know who's in the audience this evening. If you'd go ahead and share that in the chat for us. All right, we've got at least one 10th grader in the audience. Excellent, excellent. Yep, great time to start getting this information. Absolutely. All right, awesome. Well, it looks like we will probably have a bit of a mix. I'm seeing some 10th graders so far. Oh, 10th and 11th, there's that mix. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and jump on in. Again, thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Brittany Edwards, and I'm the Director of Instruction and Training at Bright World Tutors. Prior to joining Bright World Tutors, I've been in the education industry and specifically tutoring, private tutoring, online tutoring for the past 14 years. So I've really first worked as an independent tutor, helping students, in high school and middle school on a range of math and English topics, as well as standardized test prep. And so I've really learned a lot through that direct work as a tutor. And then through the last, say, 5 or so years, I've also parlayed that knowledge and expertise into helping other tutors get better at their craft, managing departments for major online education firms, and really dialing into these standardized tests to better help my students along in their goals overall, and to also help other tutors, really ensure that those students are seeing the success that they aim for. So I look forward to sharing, everything that I've learned over the years with you tonight and help you on that journey as you're getting into it, maybe for the first time, maybe you've done it before, but there's been a lot of changes. A lot about these exams have changed over the last year, 2 years. And so, if you did this with a student even 2, 3 years ago, there's going to be some new information for you this evening. Things in some regards can look a little different. All right, so what are we actually going to be exploring today? So we'll talk about those PSAT score reports. If you're, you can take the PSAT 9th, 10th, or 11th. Many students first take it as 11th graders. You may have taken it as 10th graders as well as at MSD. And so we'll talk about those score reports, what they tell you, how that's kind of your first step in exploring these options that you have for college admissions testing. Then we'll dive into the 2 main tests around these policies, so you have a clearer sense of what they are, what they entail, what some of those questions look like, some of their key differences, and in that way that'll help you start to understand maybe which path is better for you or your student. We'll also talk about a SMART testing timeline, taking into consideration when in your high school journey you want to actually start preparing for these exams explicitly. And we'll talk a little bit about some insider strategies as well, to give you some of those tips and tricks and really important considerations as you start this journey and start these considerations for your students who are looking to apply to college a few years down the road. All right, but first, before we can really jump into the PSAT, that score report, I just want to give a little background about, why your students are taking these exams like the PSAT, or, why they want to really even think about it at all. And that's really because of the policies for many major US colleges and universities. So when you're applying to college, there are three main policies for admissions testing. When you apply to college, it's kind of like giving a resume. When you're out in the real world trying to get a job, you give your resume of, your past education. In the college application world, that's more like your transcript, how you've been doing in those classes, what the strength of that transcript is, the rigor of those courses, and how you've done in them. They'll also look at things like your extracurriculars. You've got things like, the application essays you've got to do. But then there's this piece of admissions testing. And there has been some changes to the policies around admissions testing since the pandemic, but there really has for a long time been three major policies that we've seen in the US, some much more popular than others. And that popularity has certainly shifted since the pandemic back in 2020, 2021. So you have really three main policies, which are that the test is required, that it's optional, or that they don't want to see it at all. And so here, the bubbles on my screen, they somewhat represent the popularity of each. The optional, that policy is really the most prevalent right now in the US. Many schools have gone to an optional testing policy, which means they will accept an SAT or ACT score if you submit it as part of your application, but it's also up to you. It's not required that you do, but they say if you want to add it in, you can. And many schools did go towards this policy. We saw this really shoot up in popularity after the pandemic. Because, a lot of schools were really leaning more on looking at that holistic view of students, trying to see more of that roundedness in the student overall and their accomplishments. And because of, kind of the learning upset that happened with the pandemic, they felt like that was a fairer way at that time to give students the option, because students were impacted really in a variety of different ways from the pandemic and how that kind of disrupted normal everyday learning. So that policy is still very popular. Many colleges in the US are testing optional. However, that doesn't mean that, if it's test optional, you want to opt out of it automatically. So we'll talk a little bit about that. A lot of colleges are still requiring it. Not the vast majority. Again, that's more of the optional policy these days. But we are seeing an uptick more and more of colleges and universities going back to requiring it if they did switch to optional, over these last 5 years. And so for that required policy, there's no wiggle room. If they say it is required to give an SAT or an ACT a score as part of your application, you've got to submit it for them to really consider you as an applicant. So that's very important to know for those schools. You certainly don't want to miss that piece of your application and not really be considered as an applicant because of that one missing piece. Now, test-free means you don't have to give one. If a college out there says we are completely test-free, or another term you might see is test-blind, if you see that, then those schools, they're really saying, we're not even going to give you like a section in the application to submit this score. We don't want to see it. We don't want to know that you took it. And so, that's really a very different policy than the other two. They're looking at all the other components of the student and not considering a test score. Now, that's going to be the least popular. You're not going to see, as many colleges or universities with that policy. You're going to see the most with that optional policy and the second most with the required. And here's a quick list, very much a truncated list of some of the colleges and universities that fall under each policy. So for example, The California State University system and the University of California system. Both of those are test-free. They've been very staunch in that position that they are test-free, and they seem to be planning to stay there for a while. So if you are eyeing any schools in California, you'll see that they are largely test-free, test-blind, especially in those school systems. Now, you'll notice that that list is a little shorter. Again, all of these lists are certainly truncated, but again, there's just not going to be that many colleges that are test-free in that policy. It's going to be much more likely that you're running into a test optional or test required school. For example, Hampshire College has been test-free for years and years and years, really before it even got somewhat more popular after the pandemic. Test optional, you'll see, some notable names there, of course, Duke, Northwestern, Columbia. So these schools, do allow you to submit it if you want, but you don't have to if it doesn't strengthen your overall application. Now you'll notice a little asterisk on University of Miami. That's because they're currently test optional, but they do plan to start requiring testing the fall of 2026. And I put that on there because that is part of the shift we're starting to see, some more selective colleges, but overall colleges are starting to have that shift back to test required. And, that's largely because they're finding that, with how varied the school curriculums are, the rigor of courses, what students cover, depending on what course load they take. There's just a lot of variety in the American schooling system. And so some of these universities are noticing that that extra piece of information, of data about these students really helps them to better clarify some of their academic readiness. So that is why we are seeing more colleges go back to test required. University of Miami being an example of that. And then in the test required, you will see some, tried and true Florida institutions like UF and FSU. You'll also see some top names there like MIT and Yale, excuse me, and even MIT is a more recent going back to test required. So again, it is very important when you're starting to look at your college list, starting to get those together, you really want to source the most up-to-date information. You want to be sure that you're going to these college websites and looking at what they've most recently published in terms of their testing policies, because it can change year to year. So, even next year, if I'm giving this presentation, this list could be different. Excuse me. But the key takeaway I want to really impart from this idea of the different policies is that even though a lot of these schools are saying it's optional, for many students, those tests do provide an opportunity to strengthen their their application, their education. Although yes, they do get to review stuff they haven't seen in a while when they're doing test prep, and it sharpens some of those maybe older skills they haven't used in a while. But no, it can really help to strengthen their application, again, because it may be that extra piece that helps them stand out from some of their peers. Perhaps their GPA or transcript didn't quite get the rigor that a certain school is looking for, but they see they have, just a really good competitive score on one of these exams. It could very well, be that piece that helps them make the difference to that admissions officer. It is also important to note that a lot of universities and colleges will consider an SAT or ACT score for scholarships or course placement. So there's other benefits to students as well, in addition to the how it plays into their admissions. All right, so now that we understand kind of why, right? Why do we have a PSAT? Why do we think about the SAT and ACT so much? Well, it helps us with these college admissions and meeting those policies. So now let's better understand your PSAT score results. If you took it this past October, you should have gotten your results already. And so we'll just take a look at what they're telling you and what kind of insights you can gather from those reports. All right, so you'll notice here I have a screenshot of one on the left side of the screen. So of course you've got your total score at the top. This is your PSAT score when you take it, the PSAT National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. When you take that version of it, your top score is out of 1520. So you'll note that's just a little different than the full SAT score of 1600. But it is still meant to be a representation of how your student would do if they take the SAT like on that same day or without any further preparation. So it is still a good way to kind of get that general sense of about where your student would score should they take the official SAT. And besides the score difference, there's really not much different in terms of number of questions or difficulty levels from the PSAT and MSQT versus the SAT. There's a few concepts that they leave off of the PSAT, but by and large, they're getting a taste of a lot of what they would see on the actual official SAT. So that's the first thing, right? You're looking at the score, kind of seeing where that fell for you out of a 1520. And then you also may notice the percentiles, right? So here with the asterisks, we see percentiles for the students. Now, that is really based on the grade level when they take it. So that's an important part to note here. 10th graders, for example, if you take it as a 10th grader, you may see you have 1 percentile. But if you were to, test that same day as an 11th grader, you might notice that those percentiles drop. So it is measuring based on the grade that you're in against your own grade level. And generally speaking, those buckets of how students do it tend to strengthen. Students tend to do better on the PSAT when they take it as an 11th grader. So it's typically a little harder to possibly get into some of those higher percentiles when you take it as an 11th grader. You certainly can, just saying when you compare it between the 10th and 11th grades. And then finally here, you do have your breakdown of each section score. That kind of gives you a general sense of how you did per section. But, really when you start to think about more so the granularity of, how you did and what topics on those sections, you're going to want to look further into your score report. So for example, on the next page of the score report, you have the knowledge and skills section. And here you get a little bit more information than you do with just the scores per section. For example, you get the number of questions that, can come in each domain, gives you that general range of how many questions of each you get. You get these kind of bars, right? The ones in black and white that help to give you a general visualization of how well you did. Did you kind of get to that top range? Are all your bars filled black? Do you have some filled and some not? So it's kind of a quick representation to show you strengths and areas of opportunity. For example, this student, right, clearly is doing very well in information and ideas. We'll see all their bars are to the top and that the performance indicated here is in one of the top ranges as for that section, a 680 to 760. Now you'll notice, right, that drops a bit when we talk about craft and structure. The student, dropped to that range of 490 to 540. So just looking at this, right, we can quickly see, well, reading for main ideas, things of that nature, that looks to be a strength of the student. But things around craft and structure, they'd want more work on to strengthen their score overall. Also, another useful part that's included on this section, you'll notice this hyperlink, and that's usually found on your PSAT score reports. It's either printed if you're looking at more of that PDF version, or if you're accessing it digitally, it usually is a hyperlink you can click. That's a really useful website that you can also use to get more specific information about the specific topics and concepts that may be falling within those different ranges. So if you haven't checked that out at all, I do recommend you click into it and see the more specific information that it can share with you as well. All right, so that's kind of the overview of your typical PSAT score, the one that's you see on that first page. But you also have this second score that is shown on the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test, and that is your index score. And so this index score is just a different way to kind of take how you did and calculate it into a different style of score. And this is the one that they use to figure out eligibility for the National Merit Scholarship. Now, you may have heard of this scholarship. It has been around for quite a while. It is a very competitive scholarship. I think that's the first piece of information I really want to share. As you see on the screen, less than 1% of juniors earn this scholarship every year. So you're talking about, out of 1.6 million students that might take the PSAT as a junior, about 7,600, somewhere in there, are actually earning a scholarship. So it is very competitive. Not to say you couldn't win it or your student couldn't win it, but it's just important to note that. You could earn $2,500 towards college, which is great. Any extra money towards college always helps. It is important to note that in order to be eligible for the scholarship, you do have to take it as a junior. And so if you've taken it as a 10th grader, you might see about what this score would be for you now, but you will have another opportunity if you're interested in maybe qualifying for that when you take it as a junior to get your new index score. For the last year or two, just so you're aware, for Florida, this student, right, we're seeing an index score of 169. For 2025, the Florida index score was 217. And I believe for this year, it's going to be around 219. So just to give you an idea of where you're falling as a Florida student. They do look, you're first eligible through how you do per state. And so that's why it's also important to know how you measure compared to other Floridian students. So that's kind of the first way they go through possible eligibility is they see how students did nationally, and then they see how students did by state. Now, let's say you do become a semifinalist and you want to work to be a finalist in the scholarship. There are a lot of steps you still have to take after that in order to actually win the scholarship. And so again, it's just good to know up front, it's not as easy as taking a test and doing really well and getting that extra scholarship money. But as you'll see here, some of those steps do include not only taking the PSAT, but then taking an SAT or ACT, an official one, and scoring within a certain score range of that. Having a competitive GPA, like a 3.5 plus unweighted. You also are expected to demonstrate leadership. They do ask for letters of recommendation from your high school principal or someone your principal designates as a school official. They'll also ask you for a personal essay. And so, this is very much like an application at this point for the scholarship. Now, it is important to note, about half of students who become semifinalists end up being finalists or even do the work to try to become finalists. So, that's already one step kind of in the way. If you do become a semifinalist, you might want to try it. A lot of students say, never mind at that point. So, you may get in on that point, considering that. And then also, it's just good to point out that because this is such a competitive scholarship, there's actually other corporate sponsorships or merit-based scholarships that are tied to your PSAT score and your national merit eligibility. So there could be an opportunity where if you are eligible, but you don't quite get the scholarship, other corporations or schools might contact you and saying you are eligible for a merit scholarship based on your strong scores. So it's not only potentially unlocking that $2,500, but you could open up really, another kind of chest of opportunities for those scholarship or corporate sponsorship monies for college. All right, so we understand a little bit more about the PSAT, right? What those scores are telling us, how to look at them for our kind of strengths and areas of opportunity, what that index score means, and how it helps you towards understanding your eligibility for the National Merit Scholarship. So let's jump to the SAT and the ACT. These are the two most prevalent, most popular admissions exams. They are the ones where if, a school says you can submit one if you want, or you're required, every one of them that says that will accept either the SAT or ACT. And so let's look at those differences and similarities and start to understand, what these tests are and, what our students would be doing on test day. All right, so as I said earlier, the SAT, right, you can get a 1600 on. You're really testing that day for say 2 hours and 14 minutes. You'll notice that the content, it's broken down into two sections, just like you saw in a PSAT, the reading and writing section, and that's the combined reading comprehension as well as with standard English grammar rules, punctuation, things of that nature. So all of that is in one section on the SAT, and then they have a separate math section as well. You'll notice you have a few more questions in reading and writing than you do than in math on the SAT. You're going to have 98 questions total on the digital SAT. Now let's compare that to the ACT. Now the ACT has a couple of iterations now. They did just roll out this past April and September their enhanced ACT. So that is kind of a leaner version of the more traditional test that they've been putting out for decades now. So what we're looking at here is first really a focus on the part of the exam that goes towards your composite score. So the three main sections now that are getting added in and averaged for that overall composite score, those are your English section, your reading section, and your math section. So when you take that version of this test, when you take just those three sections, it's 2 hours and 5 minutes. You'll notice there each section, the English has 50 questions, math 45, reading 36. It's going to be 131 questions total. So we kind of see a difference there, right? Less questions on the SAT than the ACT. Some students see that and they get excited, but there's more consideration. So let's continue on. Now it is important to note, you have about the same opportunity each testing cycle to sit for these exams. The SAT gives you 8 opportunities to test. The ACT gives you 7. And as you'll see, the cycles generally considered from like August to June or September to July. So generally you're going to have 7 or 8 opportunities to sit for the test. Not that students need to sit for it that many times, but it just shows you, you really have the opportunity to look forward at your schedule, at your student schedule, and have a sense of like, when would really work for them to fit these tests into the other work that they're doing for school, for their extracurriculars, really the other stuff they've got going on in life. For both tests, there is no guessing penalty, so that's, always a great thing to keep in mind. It does make sense to just try to get an answer in, even if you're running short on time. You may get lucky and get that extra point. And there's no deduction of points from incorrect answers. They're really just adding up what you get correct. And finally, you'll notice a little bit of a difference in the score releases. When you take an SAT, you're going to get your score generally in 10 to 14 days. The ACT is maybe a little longer. It's about 14 to 28 days. Generally speaking, a lot of students get their scores on the shorter end of these ranges, the 10 days or the 14 days. But just to say, depending, sometimes it can take a little longer. So there's some kind of basics about the SAT and ACT, but let's get in a little bit more into, kind of the content and what they're going to see on the exam as well. So for example, right, when we talk about reading and writing, that would be English and reading for the ACT. You'll notice a pretty big difference in terms of word count, right? The SAT, part of its change to the digital SAT structure was to kind of remove longer reading passages and input instead these short passages in which there's a new passage for every question. So for each question, and we'll see an example in a little bit, students get just a small kind of snapshot of a passage to read and then have to answer some kind of question on it. Now that is different from what the ACT will show students. They are generally longer passages with multiple questions per passage. So certainly a different structure in that way. Now the enhanced ACT overall has shortened the reading on its side. So, if you took an old ACT, you'll notice maybe these passages got a little shorter, but in comparison with the SAT, they are still longer overall. Let's see here. I'm going to jump down for a moment. The calculator policy. So it's important to note that you are allowed to use a calculator throughout the entire sections, the math sections of either test. For both, you can bring in the calculator that you want to use, like your TI-84, if you're really comfortable with that. Of course, there are some limitations, so you always want to check the calculator policy, but TI-84 is standard. That's pretty allowable overall. For these digital versions of the exams, they also have inset calculators too. For example, Desmos is a very powerful calculator that the students have access to in the Blue Book testing app for the SAT. And students, really are finding that useful to working through those questions. So calculators are allowed, and certainly it makes sense to get comfortable with even the ones provided in the digital format. Because you'll be surprised at how easy it can be to access it and do the work when it's right in front of you on the screen instead of having to kind of look down at a second device. Let's see, now that brings me to this idea of digital versus paper. Now 2 years, I believe, just over 2 years, the SAT has been digital. So unless you have a special accommodation, there's really no paper testing for the SAT anymore. It is a completely digital exam. The ACT is still allowing you that option. They did just roll out their digital version. There was a kind of a soft launch in April and then more of a full launch of that in this past September. But they also still have the paper version. So, you still have a little bit more flexibility in the format that you take the test on, should you be thinking about the ACT. You'll also notice the difference of adaptive versus linear. That adaptive structure for the SAT, essentially that means that, if your student scores a certain way on the first module of a section, if they get a certain amount of questions correct, they can get into the harder second module of either section. And that really starts to have implications on what their total score could be. Students that are aiming for that, 1500, 1450, 1600 on the SAT, they need to get into those second harder modules to even unlock the opportunity to get those high scores. That is why the SAT is able to have less questions overall. This adaptive structure allows them to, really glean those same insights about student performance with fewer questions. Now, the flip side of that is what we saw earlier with the ACT. The ACT, even though it is now a digital test in some ways, they're still paper, but they have digital. It is still a linear test. So it's not adaptive. Students, it's just really the questions are built as they were designed in that certain order for this exam, and that's the order in which any student taking it that day is going to see. And so that is why you do see more questions on the ACT overall, because, essentially they need more questions to be able to assess the same amount of knowledge at that point. And then finally, you'll notice here there are sections about the science and the essay. Science and the essay, those don't exist separately on the SAT. It is just the math and the reading writing section. But the ACT, these are some of those extra add-ons now that you have that you can really take into consideration. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about what why you have those as an options and whether or not it may make sense for you. But just know the ACT really has three possible versions now you can take. You can take it just the baseline, which is your English, reading, and math. You can take it those three and add science or writing, or you can take it those three and add both science and writing. So of course, as you add sections, that test is going to get longer. And then finally, I want to go over the unique challenge of each of these exams. Really for the SAT, many students find, more of the unique challenge of this exam is that the questions aren't as straightforward as some of the exams that they're used to in their class, or even if they're comparing to the ACT. Generally speaking, SAT questions, not all of them, but a lot of them really ask students to pull in ideas and concepts and skill sets from different areas and put them together in one question to answer that question well. And so that tends to make them a little bit less straightforward and maybe a little bit more challenging to a degree. Now, the unique challenge for the ACT is your timing per question. You're going to have less time per question on the ACT than you will on the SAT. And so, if for the students who can quickly jump into questions, cut them loose, if they know they don't know how to do it on a first pass, they feel confident in making eliminations, choosing an answer and moving on, and really working in that fast pace, then they may be well suited for the ACT because you just have that quicker pace per question. It did get a little more time per question for the ACT with the enhanced, but still, when you compare the two, you're going to get more time per question on the SAT. All right, so let's look a little bit more closely at some of those differences I was talking about, the unique challenges and differences between each exam. So, for example, here's a challenging algebra question from the SAT. Now, this is a difficult level question. So this is like out of levels 1, 2, and 3. We're talking level 3 here. Parents, if this looks like, something you've never seen or haven't seen in a while, don't worry. Some students feel that way initially too. But essentially, if you take a look here, right, if we read it, we see this equation with a lot of different components to this equation. And then it says in the given equation, S and R are constants, S is greater than 0. If the equation has infinitely many solutions, what is the value of S? All right, so there's really a lot for students to unpack here. Students need to understand kind of what kind of equation it is, right? It's not necessarily explicitly told to them. They'd have to look at it and feel comfortable knowing that that's a linear equation and how to work with that. They also are going to see this idea of infinitely many solutions and, really start to understand what that means and how to apply it to that equation. You'll notice fractions in the equation itself, something, some students try their best to forget after middle school how to deal with fractions, but, you'll see them pop up again on the SAT. Not only that, but managing a problem with constants and variables. And so that's kind of an extra layer, another piece here for the student to work through, to understand, to get to the final answer. You'll also notice this is a student-produced response. So on the ACT, all the math questions are multiple choice. On the SAT, the majority are multiple choice, but there are some student-produced responses in which the student has to type in their own answer. And so you'll notice you don't see a multiple choice here. So this would be one where students are expected to actually find for themselves the value of S and put that into their test to answer the question. So that's the SAT, but let's look at the ACT, right? We talked about how the ACT tends to be a little bit more forward in terms of its wording. And so here, right, again, we have a challenging algebra question. It says the polynomial function defined by p of x equals x cubed plus x squared minus 8x minus 12 has x minus 3 as one of its linear factors. What are all and only the zeros of p? Okay. Now that is challenging math, right? So we're not trying to say they're not going to see some of the harder stuff from, say, algebra 2 in here. However, notice how this question clearly defines what kind of function it is. We know it's a polynomial function. We have it listed for us right under. It even gives us one of the factors, and then it asks us for the zeros. That might be like a slight thing that students need to recap on, excuse me, but zeros is just another way of saying solutions. So as long as the student knows that and how to handle this kind of equation, they're basically already halfway there into getting to the answer. Also notice that they have the answer choices there. So they could also work with those if they're feeling stuck. They could try to plug that in some way and see if they can get to a solution that proves true. So a little just more direct, even though this is still a challenging question. It's challenging because of the kind of math it's covering and the knowledge you need to know, but you're not having to pull in as many other ideas into being able to solve it here. All right, and just to take a closer look at some reading samples. Excuse me, I've been talking a lot today. Here's an example of the passage from the ACT for reading. So again, you'll notice this is a full passage, right? It's kind of like an article in a newspaper or a magazine rather. This is going to require students to read and understand it in entirety. And that can be a challenge for students. On the ACT, they're generally going to have 4 of these longer reading passages, each with 9 questions per passage. So it requires students a little bit more so to really understand that passage as a whole, to not get lost in the details or the reading itself as they go through, and then carry that information to answering the questions afterwards. If you're kind of considering the ACT and looking at passages like this, one key thing that you want to keep in mind is to break those passages up. One of the biggest time kind of wasters you could do on this test is start reading and read through like half or more than half of this passage and realize like you zoned out after 2 sentences and you have no idea what you're reading. In that way, many students have to start from the beginning of the passage and continue reading again. And if you have to do that multiple times, you're really going to be eating into your timing per question. So if you do go for passages like this that are longer, it's important to break them up and make sure you understand it per paragraph before moving on. That way, if you do tend to lose focus, you're only rereading a smaller section at a time. You're not having to start from the front and really utilizing that time over and over again. And then here you'll see an example from the SAT. So like I said, right, a lot shorter. In the middle of the page, there's a little snippet of, kind of a literary narrative, similar to what we saw on the first page. But, we're looking at 200 or so words in this one. So just a lot shorter. You'll see here, you do have a passage per question. So the 2 main reading intensive domains for the SAT are the information and ideas and craft and structure. So you'll see overall you're getting 12 to 14 and 13 to 15 questions in those domains for the exam overall. But some students really find this smaller bite size per passage a question. They really find that manageable, some of them. Now, it is a lot of different information all on one test, so it may not be the best fit for every student, but it is a difference certainly of how the 2 exams really present the reading for you. But I would say the main tip here, because you have these passages per question, it can be kind of tempting to just dive into the reading without knowing what kind of question you're on. So for the SAT, it really makes a lot of sense to read that question first. Here, right, our question says, what does the text most strongly suggest about the story of Hans Castorp? And so now that I've read that and I know kind of the focus of this question and what I really want for my answers, I can start reading it with better intent. And so that really helps students go a long way for these passage and question kind of structures. So they kind of know what they want to be thinking of as they start that work of reading. All right, so let's jump into those optional sections for the ACT and SAT to kind of round out our discussion of the similarities and differences. So you do have the science option. You can opt in or out of that. Since the ACT changes are so new, not all colleges have really come out to say what their policy is for the ACT science section. It was, just this last year, it was part of the composite score, but it is no longer part of the composite score moving forward. And I think that's where, that's certainly where the caution comes in for us, where because it was once kind of part of the score and expected as part of the test, since it's been removed, not all colleges have come out to clearly say, oh, that's okay with us. We don't care about the science, or no, that's really not okay. You need to be taking the science section. Some of that information is out there, but by and large, this is still something being somewhat figured out from the colleges themselves. So because of that, it is important right now to be careful with your opting in or out. It is a strong consideration for students to take this, to opt into the science section if they're aiming for STEM-focused programs in college. The science section score would be reported as a separate STEM score. That would be coupled with the math that they take. And so it's kind of a separate score that schools would get to show them, hey, here's their strength in STEM specifically. Some schools are asking for that, especially if you're going in for those STEM-focused programs. But even if the school hasn't said it explicitly and that's kind of what you're looking at, right now would probably be a good idea to take it to be safe. Worst case, you took it and you didn't need it. But the absolute worst case is you don't take it and you need it. At that point, you're like scrambling to get a new test done. And that can be really difficult at the, kind of at the finish line when you're applying to colleges. It's also really still a strong consideration for students who are still deciding where they're going to apply to, and for the same reason. If we're not quite sure of our exact college list, we may not be able to get all those answers, and you want to keep your options open. So again, if you don't have exactly your college list and definitely, certainly all of those colleges aren't asking for it, you're going to want to keep it in the running. Probably take it until you know for sure you don't need it. Now for the writing optional section, that does not factor into your composite score on the ACT, and it hasn't in quite a while. It's now reported separately as an ELA score. But to be frank, really only a very small number of colleges or universities are asking for this at all. I think like University of Montana Western requires the writing section, but it is really very far and few between. So overall, most students can use like other factors of their application to showcase their strong ELA skills. Things like, those applications essays that they'll be asked to write, how they did in their core ELA classes, on their transcript. This is kind of the flip side. Unless you know for sure a school is asking for the writing, you're probably on a pretty safe bet that you do not need to add that into your option if you go for the ACT. All right, now, we talked a lot about the kind of similarities and differences between these exams, and that starts to give you a sense of what might be better for you. It is really, though, a best practice to take a practice exam of each to really make sure you're dialing in on the one that makes the most sense for you or your student. And so trying out these exams in a practice SAT or practice ACT, whether that be the official PSAT or like a mock SAT or ACT, those are low stakes, really environments that you can utilize to see, how does the timing feel for you? What are those question types like for you? Is there one that you felt more confident with as you were testing? Those are really the questions that you or your student can consider. And then you can also compare your scores with a concordance chart to see if there's a clear winner for you. Some students will take one of each and do really a lot better on one versus the other. And if your score is very different on one than the other, you take the one you're already doing better on. But a lot of students, they do tend to do about the same, and that's where those other questions come in. Do you feel like the timing is approachable with some preparation? The question wording, right? Does that seem something that you can get down with extra prep? Or, did you like that more straightforwardness of the ACT? That seems to be something you could get a handle on more easily. So really a lot of information about what your preferences and where your strengths lie can come out of taking a practice of each and then comparing those scores. All right, so we're just about through here. Let's talk quickly about a SMART testing timeline. As you really consider these exams and how they fit in, you want to do your best to plan for when it works best for you to fit them into your schedule and prepare for them well. So the good news is if there are any ninth graders in here, that's just too early for to prep overall. Your ninth grade year is really about focusing on a strong high school start. You want to get those foundations really strengthened and start on a good note in your core academic classes. It's also an opportunity to explore extracurriculars and see where those interests lie and what you might want to commit to for the next 3 or 4 years in terms of extracurriculars. So too early for ninth grade. You really don't have to start stressing these tests at that point. The 10th grade year, that could be an option for some students. Of course, you still want to be working towards a strong GPA and transcript. But, if you're in your 10th grade and by 10th grade, you've already taken Algebra 2, then you could consider testing for the SAT or ACT in spring or summer of your 10th grade year. The reason why I use Algebra 2 as a marker, because largely these exams are not going past Algebra 2 in terms of math content. So if you've gone through that class fully, you've really seen all the math you're going to see, or excuse me, you're going to need for the exam. Some students get to a very high level math track early on. So if that's you, you may be a contender for taking that 10th grade, that SAT or ACT as a 10th grader. It's not as common though. Most commonly is to test as an 11th grader. But again, on where you fell in Algebra 2 could determine when would make sense for you in your 11th grade year. If you took Algebra 2 in 10th grade and finished by 10th grade, then by 11th grade, you could potentially take your SAT or ACT in the fall of that year. But if you're enrolled in Algebra 2 in 11th grade, you'll likely want to wait till you have a lot of that class under your belt so you see those topics and concepts. And so a timeline of testing in the spring or summer or even early senior year is likely a better option for you at that point. And so just keep in mind, right, these are cumulative tests, so they do build off information you learned from school, but that doesn't mean we have to start super early in specific test prep. Ninth grade, focus on those academics and extracurriculars. Maybe in 10th grade, you could possibly focus on it if you're on a very elevated math track. But by and large, you'll likely start focusing on this in 11th grade, and that still affords you a lot of time. Certainly, as you start 11th grade, if you want to start thinking about that, or right around now is a great time too. All right, now when you're starting to really think about that plan, just to break this down for you, Like we talked about earlier, you do want to decide on the SAT or ACT. So once it's your time frame, this makes sense for you. Let's start considering, what test dates I should be looking at, how I need to plan this out. That should be your first step, is making sure you're deciding on the SAT or ACT, taking practice exams of both and comparing those results. Then you want to just make sure you have a sense of your score goals. You don't have to have your college list completely ironed out, but you want to have an idea of what you're aiming for. Not every school is going to require that you try to earn a 1600 or a 36. Some schools have very competitive applications where they're seeing a lot of their students come in at like a 1450, a 1500. It really depends on the schools that you're interested in. So start to get a sense of what that could be for you, so you have a clearer idea of where you'd like to see your final scores fall for either exam. And then once you have that idea, you kind of know your starting point, you have a sense of where you're trying to go, what kind of goal scores you're aiming for. Just make sure you're reviewing your commitments. It is important to prepare for these exams. Sometimes if you can help it, you want to try to see if there is other stuff going on that really takes up a lot of time and is not going to allow you to maybe fit in that kind of preparation as easily. If you're taking AP or IB exams, right, you might want to think when those final exams are and try to plan for test dates that are not right in the same month. It can be a lot for some students doing all those major tests all in one period. If you're traveling for, sports or anything like that, you may want to consider, when you're always on the road and you just will be too tired to prepare for the SAT or ACT versus maybe when you have more downtime and ability to do that. It is important to review those commitments to try to fit it in where you can, hopefully, without overwhelming yourself too much, and then set that prep schedule. It is best to try to really decide on 2 or 3 testing dates, register for them, and to commit to a preparation schedule to allow you to get to the goals that you're aiming for. And it is quite common for students to take 2 or 3 exams of these for a few different reasons. One is that students tend to do better on their second or third testing. They get that experience under their belt. They've usually used how they did on the first one to help them understand how to continue preparation for the second. So there's really a lot of benefits to doing the multiple testing dates and to have that as the plan as you begin. All right. All right, guys. So the last few points, and then we'll wrap it up here. Just a couple of insider tips, insider strategies for this whole process. Like I was kind of mentioning on the last slide, you do want to plan for a marathon, not a sprint. Most students will need to review concepts that they haven't seen in quite a while. For example, right, you're going to see pre-algebra, algebra, geometry on these exams. Some students would have been 1 or 2 years removed from some of those topics by the time they see this test. And so it's just important to note that besides understanding the test itself and strategies for the test, there are those ideas from class that they may just need some extra time to make sure that they're remembering and being able to tie everything together with the newer stuff too. And so oftentimes students certainly do better when they allow themselves more of a runway to do that preparation, and they're not trying to cram it in say a couple of weeks or a month. Also, if you are preparing for these exams, keep in mind how important regular practice tests are. Random problems, one-off problems, that's definitely helpful. It gives you a sense of how you do on that question with that concept. But, one of the big pieces of doing well in these tests is being able to do all of that in that timed condition, being able to jump seamlessly from reading, writing to math, getting a sense of that timing, that pacing. And so that's the kind of practice you really only get with the full-length practice tests. It's just a very important part. If you're doing preparation at all, do be sure that you are fitting in regular practice exams. And then finally, you don't just want to be running through questions, oh, get it right or wrong, okay, and move right on. It is really quite effective to reflect on stuff that you missed or even the stuff you had to take an educated guess on to see kind of what got in your way. If you're able to go back through questions that you did and did wrong, or, guessed and got lucky, you can start to understand, what was that missing piece for you? What was the challenge and how can you overcome it? And when you start learning from those mistakes in that way, you're going to see that you're able to take those learnings with you to the next time you see a question like that. So it's such an important part of preparation as well, revisiting work that you've done, not just continuing to do new work and hoping it gets better each time. You do want to look back at that work you've done and learn from it. All right, guys. Well, we're getting to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time and attention so far. As I said earlier, this webinar was presented by Bright World Tutors and me, Brittany Edwards, for our MSD family, parents, and students. So we really do appreciate your time tonight. You'll see at Bright World Tutors, we do offer both test prep and academic tutoring, one-on-one tutoring online. We have access to great high quality digital resources for the PSAT, SAT, and ACT, and other features that help make your program seamless and efficient and effective. So of course, we would love to help you illuminate your potential and certainly help you towards any goals towards academics or test prep. And I am here with my colleague, Martha Leduc. She works for Bright World as well as our sister company, International College Counselors. So I just want to give it over to her for a quick second. And then if you have any questions, we'll check the chat and answer any questions that might have come in or that you might have now.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. And it's a pleasure to have been able to present regarding Bright World and test prep. And so basically just wanted to let you know, we're here for your counseling needs as well. We've been around for 21 plus years, small firm or medium-sized firm, I would say, of about 18 counselors. First step to find out about our programs is just giving us a call. I will do an intake and learn a little bit about your student. We have various programs from Florida programs to comprehensive programs. I do see we have 10th graders. So basically, we can definitely go through all of your needs and explain how we can assist. We look forward to hearing from you, and we can definitely get into a little bit more detail once you guys call in. Thank you.
Awesome, Martha. Thank you so much. Well, here's Martha's contact information on the screen if you do want to contact her for additional information. We also have Marlene Fishbein, who's not on the call, but she is local and happy to assist you as well. So thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. I saw there was just a couple of questions in the chat. So I'll address those now. And then if you do have any others, we welcome you to input them now. So I did just answer this in the chat, but someone had asked, do colleges care which test or version of ACT we take? No, so they are accepting the ACT. You can take it digitally or paper. Both now are the enhanced version, so it's really just a different format. Colleges are going to accept the digital version or the paper version, no problem there. Earlier too, I got a question. I did answer it in the presentation, but I'll say it again just in case. Do you have an idea of what the index score for Florida, will be this year? That's about the index score for your National Merit Scholarship. This class of 2026, it looks to be it's going to be a 219. Last year was a 217. So just to give you a sense of where it is and where you might want your student to be. Those are usually good markers to use, say, for the next year or so, about a good place to aim for your student. All right. Martha, did we have any questions come through on the Q&A at all that I haven't answered?
No, you got them all.
Okay, awesome. All right, lovely. All right, well, it doesn't look like any other questions are coming in, and I know we're just a little over time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Again, if you do have any further questions, please do feel free to reach out to Martha or Marlene. And again, thank you so much for your time and attention. And we wish you all the best of luck as you navigate your testing for admissions to college and beyond. Bye, good night.